I'm Christopher C. York, instructor of philosophy at Langara College.
And I'm Zan Plesner. I'm a student at Langara College.
And this is Synthesis and Sophistry. Today we're considering Lois Pineau's article, Date Rape, a Feminist Analysis. So it should go without saying from the title that this is a trigger warning, trigger, all the way down triggers. Obviously, if you've had some traumatic experience with regard to this will be an uncomfortable listen. It may be an uncomfortable listen even if you hadn't had this experience, because you probably, odds are, know somebody who has had this experience or who has been sexually harassed at the very least. And so this topic is a minefield, an emotional minefield. And we're going to do the best we can to present the contents, the philosophical contents, in a neutral way, but proceed with the knowledge that this is the topic. It's not going to be easy to discuss, and we ask for your philosophical charity in advance.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of opening things. I just kind of wanted to open it up, like, how does this topic relate to ethics and philosophy, do you think?
Okay, so sexual morality as a sort of broad topic is a form of ethical issue, right? So it's like it's an applied ethics, I suppose, is the best way to put it. And it's one that I think is, if not under-theorized, then at least under-discussed, because it is so awkward and it makes you feel, it gives you room for uncomfortable reflections on both sides of the equation. And for that reason, I think this topic is buried in mainstream philosophical discourse, and it shouldn't be, right? Because there are points that are brought up here that everyone could benefit from hearing and reading and understanding, and maybe even using in their own lives.
Yeah, definitely. I'm in full agreement there, and I think Pineau does a really good analysis of the situation as we present it, and sets up an alternative. That being her thesis, she argues that currently we have a sort of contractual model in sexual interactions, in which each person has a role and they're obligated to do certain things. They have the right to do A and B. And she brings up a number of problems with this, which we can get into. And she says an alternative to this that would create less harm is the communicative model, in which she uses the metaphor of like having a conversation with someone, right? You're both trying to go towards the same end, and working more as a team rather than an adversary or someone to fulfill a contract for you.
That's how I feel about this podcast.
Yeah. The communicative model.
We're working together towards a goal, right? I mean, the podcast shouldn't, except in jest, become adversarial, right? So if this is a model of a good conversation, right, we both have to have the right kind of attitude towards it, right? We have to be seeking towards the same end. If you want to do a podcast about sport results, and I want to do a podcast about, space exploration, we're not. This is not a germane conversation. We won't be able to speak to each other productively.
Yeah, and Pineau points out how culturally we've been organized to metaphorically have these like conversations where expectations are brought in. So just using podcasting, it would be with this contractual model, we're kind of forced into certain roles culturally in how we speak to each other and what our expectations are, which creates negative power dynamics. How did she do this? Well, one thing she points out too is how consent has been entangled with the idea that men should be masters of seduction, in which the woman has to have this sort of faux
submissive,
yeah,
or like denying her own sexuality,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
So sort of like a methinks she doth protest too much, in the words of Shakespeare.
Yeah, yeah.
And there's an epistemological element to this, and there's also let's say a consequentialist argument against it. So let's start with epistemology, right? So people are accepting these made up essentialist sex roles, right, of the sex crazed, testosterone filled man who can't control himself. And then on the other hand, the woman who is culturally trained to deny her own sexuality and automatically reject advances, even the ones, and this is the important part, that she might secretly want but not be allowed to acknowledge it publicly that she is pro-sex. And so this mythology is bad for us epistemologically because it takes us farther away from our true selves, right? And it takes us away from our true knowledge of how sexes actually operate or how we think they should. It also raises the consequences of it raises the possibility of negative consequences. So for Pineau, this false ideology of the sex rejecting woman and the sex starved man creates the perfect formula for an increased possibility of date rapes occurring. Yes. Because the man might feel pressured to sort of live up to his fantasy of virility and insist even where maybe deep down he doesn't really even feel like insisting, and perceiving the woman to be, again, using this sort of very broad cultural stereotype that Pineau is invoking here, he might perceive her as resisting or rejecting his advances simply as part of the cultural script that's been laid out for her to read from. And so the issue here, again, epistemically, is how do you, as a male in this situation, discern a genuine no or rejection of sexual advances from a feigned no or rejection of sexual advances? So this is the sort of trap that these toxic ideologies create for men and women, and they work together to increase the likelihood of date rape, which she identifies as, and I'm reading from the quote here, non-consensual sex does not involve violence, physical pressure, or its threat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. On the lines of epistemology too, she talks about how this idea of the man seeking sexual gratification and the woman kind of having this piety about them, it gives the rapist the idea that the woman really wants it, and deep down she's getting pleasure from this, and it's a way of the man having greater knowledge of her own wants and desires than she does. In that passage, I got a little bit of echoes of de Beauvoir, man being the true form of humanity and woman being the other.
Yeah, there's that, and there's also the sort of inauthentic behavior that comes from occupying a role instead of reflecting on your true values and motivations in the situation, right? Again, any kind of cultural script following to Sartre and de Beauvoir would be an abandonment of your existential responsibility, to reflect carefully on what the situation actually is and what you actually want from it. What are your values here? And I think it's fair to say our culture, many cultures, could use a bit more work in this area. They could stand to do a bit more reflection on how they act with and behave towards the opposite sex.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's why I think it just makes so much sense, the communicative model.
It's definitely, just sorry to interrupt, but
that's fine.
It's definitely a better model than the contract model, right? The contract model is borrowed from the business world, right, where you're actually trying to literally screw somebody over, right? Economically screw somebody over. Oh, you signed the contract. We have a deal now. I'm going to stick you to this agreement that you made, whether or not it's in your interests or not. And so the analogy that Pineau brings up here in relation to the contract model is the slide analogy. All right. So the idea on the contract model of sex is once you agree to it, whatever happens next, it's all part of the ride. So you have to just, sit back and enjoy the ride. Once you're on the slide, you can't get off the slide. And obviously that's problematic, right? Because sex is something that you should have to consent to for its duration, not just for its initiation. Yeah. Right? You should be able to refuse at any time. Yeah. So I think that a better analogy, and this is one that I raised in a class that I gave on this article previously, is the restaurant analogy, right? Where you can stop eating at any time. Yeah. So yes, you initially want to have a meal and you sit yourself down, but if at any time you've had enough, the waiter does not have the right to come over and stuff the rest of your meal in your face. And if we think that's outrageous, then we should also think that continuing to have sex when someone who said they had enough is also outrageous.
Yeah, definitely. Or in this metaphor, wants another dish halfway through, or no.
Okay.
Has a different idea of what they want to eat than what you're offering.
I see where you're going now. Yeah. You threw me off a bit with that.
Yeah, no, that was poor wording on my part. And I think she ties this really well to how we implicitly regard there's this idea that sexually promiscuous women deserved when they became raped, and she says it's partly because of this contractual framing. They're setting themselves up in a role where they are putting out this contract that needs to be fulfilled under this way of seeing things, creating very harmful effects and interpretations of people's actions.
The model itself, if this is indeed the model that people are implicitly adopting with relation to sexual contact, is deeply flawed. Right. And I don't know if personally I've ever entered into an engagement with that understanding, implicitly or explicitly, that this is a contract and we're in it till we're done. Right. I never, for me, that seems alien and forced. I get what she's saying, that I can see that there's a class of person for whom this might be a belief they have. Right, about sexuality, but I don't know. You're a fella, Zan. Tell me, have you ever looked at things like as a contract when you start your business?
No, no.
Yeah.
I can't say.
I think that would be very strange. A strange thing to, I mean, first of all, occur to you, and second of all, to act on. Right? But both of those seem odd to me.
Yeah.
It seems like you might have it this seems like an ad hoc, a posteriori, after the fact kind of excuse for bad behavior. Your Honor, I thought that she'd agreed, right?
Yeah.
It sounds like you tack on as an excuse after you've done something awful.
Yeah, I do think though that she's saying it's kind of an implicit assumption, where it's not something we're actively thinking about when we partake in these roles, but I think when we're tied to these roles, they have certain expectations attached to them.
I guess, okay, so, all right, maybe, look, I'm a philosopher of sport and games, so let's talk about that a little bit. Let's say that you and I sit down to play a game of chess, right? And you after the first couple of moves, you see that it's not going your way, you don't fancy it, and you get up and leave the board. Do I have a right to make you sit down and finish the game of chess? I think not. Do you have a right to concede at any time? Yes, you do. Would I be disappointed if the game was going well and for some mysterious reason of your own, you decided to just walk through the park instead. Maybe that would be baffling to me, but I still don't have the right to insist that the game be finished, right? Because games are voluntary, right? They're voluntary pursuits, and as soon as someone, expresses their desire to stop playing, then the game is over.
Yeah.
Right? And I assume that that's a model that fits sexual encounters quite well. If you look at it with the ludic attitude, right? We're going to play. But in order to play together well, there have to be rules.
Yeah.
Right? And we should talk about those in advance so we're both clear about what the rules entail. And I think that's kind of what she's getting at with her model of communicative sexuality.
Yeah, yeah.
Safe words and the like.
Yeah, definitely. I think...
And also what kind of game you're playing.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm not sure if chess is because it's adversarial, where it seems more like how you've discussed, maybe we would want to frame
pandemic.
This, yeah.
We're going to solve the problem together.
Sort of game, right? Where
yeah.
you're constantly communicating with your teammates, making sure that the other person feels heard. And
that's the first time we'll have thought this or said this, but on this model, sex is like the game Pandemic.
Yeah, one is much more pleasurable than the other.
Which? I think it depends. You're assuming a lot of things here. You're assuming a lot of premises.
I guess in my experience.
Playing Pandemic is just always better than sex with me. I think that's as a rule. I explain it to my partners. I use communicative sexuality to say, look, this is going to be disappointing. We probably just should play Pandemic.
Yeah. Fair enough. You're really selling yourself short there. You must be.
I do it for comedic effect because a podcast on this topic, it needs a little bit of levity, and I think almost anything else in the podcast is just going to bring us down. So I'm taking the cheap laughs where I can get them.
Yeah, but in a cooperative game like that, right? I think that the experience is enhanced in either way by communicating, right? You know where the other person's at, and there's more participation that can bring a more fruitful experience about. So I like the fact that, like, the beginning of the article is quite heavy and serious, and I mean it is throughout, but there's a sort of a excitement and flourishing aspect to this model.
Sure. Yeah, because I think at the beginning she lays out the phenomenon of date rape, which of course is serious and heavy, and she treats it with the appropriate level of conceptual rigor, I think. And then I do agree, she gets a bit more hopeful and positive when she starts to describe her alternative model of human sexuality that she hopes catches on, right? And so then she's able to go from something that's merely descriptive to something that is not only evaluative, but something that she would recommend strongly.
Yeah.
And so it does change tone, I think. I'm glad you noted that.
Yeah, definitely. Another thing that I thought was helpful, she just lays out, I think, in a pretty coherent way what a good communicative partner looks like. This is on page 302. Just as a communicative conversationalists are concerned with more than didactic content, persons engaged in communicative sexuality will be concerned with more than achieving coitus. They will be sensitive to the responses of their partners. They will, like good conversationalists, be intuitive, sympathetic, and charitable. Intuition will help them to interpret their partner's responses. Sympathy will enable them to share what their partner is feeling. Charity will enable them to care. So yeah, I like that model a lot. It gives you a framework and how you could be a more virtuous partner, I guess. Rather than, I like
to be commended on my virtue after intercourse. Yeah, just that you're such a virtuous person.
I mean, using old stilted philosophical language. I don't think is usually how people communicate afterwards.
Right.
But,
Yeah.
yeah.
Not words of love.
Yeah. Yeah. But I think this
has benefited us both.
Yes. Just like robots shake hands afterwards.
Yeah. Sorry, go on.
No. I think, just like with the metaphor of games, right? It makes you a player that's more enjoyable to partake in the game with and be a teammate with. I guess I just kept thinking, because she talks about, the ideology that we've been endowed with in this sort of male seeking satisfaction and the woman shirking away from that. I remember we watched Blade Runner in your class, and
Philosophy and literature.
Yeah, philosophy and literature. And there's a scene in there that has this sort of dynamic where Harrison Ford is really kind of aggressive coming on to this woman. And
Replicant.
Replicant. Oh yeah.
So it's not, on this fantasy world narrative. I mean, I guess it's supposed to be not morally problematic because it's a robot. But the replicants so closely resemble human life forms and embody that style of cognition that arguably morally indiscernible from a human. So it is, uncomfortable to say the least, and problematic.
Yeah, and she kind of has this. She's resisting at the beginning, but then she kind of gives in. And yeah, it just, I think everyone in the class just were kind of, we discussed it like, I can't believe that this was just in this movie. And the framing of it seemed like it was supposed to be romantic in a way.
Was there saxophone in the background?
There was beautiful, lush saxophone.
That's always an indicator. The director wants you to scan this as romantic if there's saxophone in the background, I think.
Yeah. So I think it is a positive that, we recognize that is a dated and problematic way of looking at sex in general.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's progress that we could still make, but we have come a long way in a historically short time. Mm-hmm. So good job, humankind. keep up the good work. If there's a report card, you'd say needs improvement.
Yeah,
but better than last semester.
Yeah. I'm definitely not saying that we're anywhere near where we need to be. There's still like stories on the news. Again, this might be something to bring up, how she was talking in courts, how victims are framed. She talks about how the burden of proof is always on the victim in showing that they've been raped, and how this, along with the ideology of the master seducer, makes it so that the victim is always suspect and in a precarious role, I guess.
Yeah, it's difficult, right? Because the legal system is, predicated on the idea that you're innocent until you're proved guilty, and if any question can be raised as to the guilt of the accused, then the court is obligated to drop the charge. And sexual consent, it's a notoriously fuzzy boundary, right? Because one person's perception of what's going on might be different than another person's perception. I'm not, again, this is not excusing, it's just explaining, right, how this happens in the courts, right? Because I want to talk about an issue in the model of communicative sexuality that Pineau brings up in this regard. And again, like we can't just always explain and praise; we have to criticize as well. And so here's, I guess, a potential counter example, or at least a problematic case that her model of communicative sexuality I think, has to address a little bit, right? So not everybody is a great communicator. Not everybody has the vocabulary or the confidence or whatever to express themselves cleanly and clearly about their desires or their expectations or whatever else. That's one problem, right? In that only people who have gone through very liberal courses of sexual education might even consider this to be a possibility for them. And there are cultures of people right, out there who this model, it would never occur to them to apply it because it's just so out with the realm of actual lived possibility for them. And maybe this also goes for economic classes as well, right? So if you have to work, 14-hour days to just make a living, and let's say along the line, your line of work is brutalizing and it's difficult and it's hard, and you lack the emotional and financial resources to be a patient and clearly communicating lover, right? So there's whole segments of humanity that are left out of this model. And a final one that I've mentioned, right? This whole thing requires an incredible amount of not only linguistic ability and cognitive faculties, but it requires emotional sensitivity. So what if, for example, you are sexually autistic? And again, I don't know if this is a real condition. I'm just making it up for the sake of our discussion. But let's say, for instance, that for whatever reason, you're unable to pick up those cues that are the difference between a merely bad sexual encounter and a date rape, right? So should those people just not be allowed to have sex, period? Right? Is there a class of people who lack the sexual sensitivity or that miss the social cues? Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
In this case, right? Are they excluded from potential sexual activity on the basis of their lack of understanding?
Yeah. No, I think I had a similar intuition here, right? Like, the word rapist is a very harsh one, and I think one that when we label people with it, it publicly shames them in a good way, I think. And maybe under her definition, it waters that term down a little bit.
I mean, she sets aside a separate category, right? She says there's, not to put too fine a point on it, but, clear, unapologetic, unambivalent rape. Mm-hmm. And then there's this other category where things are a bit murkier, and she calls that, date rape, where the lack of consent is still a feature, but it's not violent or threatening violence.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. So it's not explicitly coercive. Mm-hmm. It's more subtle than that. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, problematic, but it's murkier.
Yeah.
It's less clear cut.
Yeah. Okay.
I think that's what you're talking about when you label somebody a rapist, and it's because they've raped, and nobody's disagreeing with the situation. Nobody has an alternate account that explains the phenomenon.
Yeah.
Or what's happened.
Yeah.
But I do think that she's been careful about that. She's set aside, she's laid the groundwork for this other category of undesirable sexual encounter, the date rape.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Presumably, some of this occurs, and I think that she would, accept this because of mistaken ideas about sex or less than ideal sources of motivation, right? Or like there are other factors in there that make it candidates for the second category that she's carved out.
Yeah. No, that clears up things for sure. I guess, to go back to your earlier point about someone who maybe lacks the vocabulary or this sort of empathy in a way. I do think that this can create problems in our current situation, and maybe it's not perfect, but I think like this is why talking about sex in general and like having sex education from a young age is really important, right? Because like I think one of the best things we can do is teach children how to balance their interests with other people's, navigate conflict, that sort of thing. And this is just sort of an expansion of that. So it's a point that's regularly made, but I think for good reason, that we need to, educate at a young age and talk about these things out in the open, be more communicative. Because then I think even those people who maybe don't have the vocabulary, they'll be more at their disposal, and there'll be better expectations around sexual encounters.
To be honest, this is why I included this article in the first year Introduction to Ethics class, because I do think that at that stage in your life, first year college, you may still have not gotten the talk from anybody in your life about how adult sexual encounters should proceed. Yeah. And you might still have a lot of mistaken, let's say cultural or emotional baggage that's kind of just stuck to you from your development, and you haven't rationally reflected on it or even considered it. You just act the way you act. You want the things you want or whatever. I think that it's important to confront not only your pre-reflective sexual inclinations and habits, but also to have access to this, alternative model that Pineau is offering. And you can refuse it. You can say, well, everything's fine with me. Communicative sexuality, that's not what I want to do. And I guess that, it's just better that you know about it than you don't. And I think that even if you reject her model of communicative sexuality for whatever reason, you can still benefit from the knowledge that if you don't make your expectations and intentions clear, that you might end up in situations where non-consensual sex might be a likely result. Yeah. And so at the very least, even if you don't want to dive headfirst into having a 3-hour seminar about your sexual needs before you have an encounter with somebody, you might hopefully take away from this article the idea that you at least need to check in now and again, and at least internally, and make sure that you're not treating sex like a contract or a slide, but more like a meal where you're the waiter and you have to check on the other person. Mm-hmm. Do they want more? Do they want less? Do they want to stop? Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's useful.
Yeah, definitely. Especially because I think, there's just so much in our culture that is fed into the ideas of masculinity and femininity and sexuality, right? So, she talks a bit about it, this sort of like stoic lover that just kind of instinctually knows everything. And
another toxic myth, perhaps, right?
Yeah. How even with certain vocabulary that can still be in the back of the minds of people during these interactions. And I think it's a way of just opening up the groundwork to say that it's normal to just check in and talk about these sort of things, and it makes a better experience for someone, even if it's a little bit awkward at times, right?
I think it goes both ways too, right? This is the other thing that's not really spoken of, but I mean, if you have an encounter with somebody and their default mode is to behave like they think men want them to, and sort of jump into sort of porn star mode from moment number one, that's also off-putting, right? That's another kind of role-playing that is based on a mistaken assumption about what your partner probably wants or finds interesting, right? So that's, I think it's something not only to protect people from the potential of date rape, it's to protect them from the potential of just awkward, awful sexual encounters.
Yeah, definitely. And she even she talks about how sometimes, for sexual encounters, there's this implicit idea that they have to go all the way. And a lot of times, again, using the meal metaphor, maybe someone just wants a salad or a soup and a sandwich. They want to hold hands or do some heavy stroking, but they don't have certain things on their mind. And unless that's talked about throughout and at the beginning, it gets back to that epistemic blind spot.
Yeah, as much as like male ideations of sex can be damaging and unideal, I feel like female ideations of what males want can also be skewed and can lead to trying too much to please what you think the average specimen of the opposite sex from your culture would want can again lead you to behaving inauthentically and less than ideally, I would think, in the bedroom, because then you're just both playing roles. I am the man, I am the woman, right? It's just like nobody's being themselves, and right, that's not doing anybody any favors, right? I don't think.
Yeah, and I guess if you do want to inhabit those roles, talking about your intentions to begin with, and doing it in that sort of way is helpful, because you know what the parameters are.
Yes. There's nothing wrong with cosplaying as Conan if the other person wants you to be in a loincloth and a headband, right? But yeah, for example, random example. But you got to lay that out ahead of time. You can't just spring that on somebody. You can't go full Conan.
No.
On the first date.
No. Okay. That left me speechless.
I win. This is a little game that I play with the podcast. If I can render Zan speechless at least once per discussion, I feel like somehow, if this were a game, I would be winning it.
Yeah, she talks about. I think she lays out a good framework of when someone is guilty of date rape, in that they're failing to consider the other person and they're no longer trying to achieve the same goal with them in a cooperative way, right? When it becomes one-sided.
I mean, this is in line with what she talks about from the sexologist's findings on page 299. They found, not surprisingly, that no communication leads to bad sex. Right. Wow. And they're, whoa, they're really up on their game, these sexologists, which means, therefore, that there's no implicit reason, there's no motivation to consent to non-communicative sex. That's what she takes to be a reason for adopting her model of communicative sex, is that, well, you're going to have good sex, or at least better sex than you would have had if you didn't put in the work to create this mutual expectation about what's going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess to expand further on like the positive aspect of this article and the existential part, right? Like, I'm just thinking, again, with the metaphor of food, if we're only presented with, food that's constantly being forced upon us, or one framework to do it, I think like maybe sharing recipes or talking about these sort of things more. There's just like sex is a certain social good, right? And if we can have better ways of going about it, maybe we'll have some sort of utopia if this becomes the model.
I mean, I think that, if you're going to make a gastronomical analogy, you could say, for instance, right, that you could communicate the fact that you don't want to have the same meal every day of the week.
Yeah, that's more what I meant to say.
And I think that a reasonably respectful partner will hear that and maybe make some sort of effort to work with your hopes rather than work against them.
Yeah, and I guess if we just have an expanded vocabulary, like that's how we get better with using language, right? Like communicating with other people. So that gives us new avenues to explore ourselves in this sort of way.
Yeah, I mean, where it gets a little rough is when they say, actually, I want to go to a different restaurant.
Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough.
But they have the right to leave the restaurant.
Yeah.
Right, and that's the thing, right? So it might hurt you as the restaurant owner if they prefer to dine somewhere else, but that's a reality you have to confront if you're in the restaurant business.
Yeah.
Gosh, I should write an article. So we're sort of stretching my analogy to cover all these.
Yeah.
I feel like
a whole article.
I think there could at least be a T-shirt in it. Got to think about merch for the podcast.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've got to monetize this somehow.
Not this episode. Any other one I'm good with.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's helpful though to frame it these sort of because I think it is a social good, just like good food and cooperative games, and it's a helpful framework to look at it through.
This is sort of beyond the scope of Pineau's article, but I mean, just like we judge cultures by their products, right? Their accomplishments of agriculture and science and architecture. Do we judge a culture by the kinds of sex that it enables?
I think so, to a degree. I think we do. Yeah.
I don't think that's unreasonable, right? So yeah, on that basis, right, I would encourage all of our listeners to do your culture proud and produce a variegated crop that will stand us in good stead historically. I want people to look back at this time in history and say, wow, just so much good communicative sex went down once that episode of Synthesis and Sophistry dropped, and people got the good word about Lois Pineau.
Yeah, that's what we're all about here.
Cultural revolution achieved one ear at a time.
All right. Well, thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Zan.